My name is Doug Delia, and I'm a first-generation American. And I'm not ashamed to say that I'm 72 years old, and I'm still searching for who I am. And that search led me through my ancestors, of course. So I went looking for them. I opened myself up. I prayed. I asked that the ancestors would come to me and tell me their stories. And since that time, I've been inundated by them. They come in my dreams. They come in my thoughts. Most of my writing now is obsessed with them. And they have told me their story, which of course is my story because that is my DNA. So my father was born in Italy, and my mother was born in Canada via France. And both of them were born there not by mistake, but in the oddest of ways, like an accidental tourist. And I'll tell you about that as I tell you about each of their stories. My grandfather on my Italian side, Baldassare, Delia, was a farmer, and he grew grapes and olives in a beautiful, picturesque valley in between Naples and Salerno. He lived in a wonderful, picturesque community, and he got married in Italy, and he came by himself in 1907 to Brooklyn. Because when you're an immigrant, you come to places where your relatives or friends are. And of course, he didn't speak English, and he didn't have much money, so he went to the Italian community in Brooklyn, and he got work as a laborer, because that's what immigrants did. And he also, because he didn't have many resources, he hotbedded. And I don't know if you're familiar with that term, but that is where a friend or a relative has an extra bed or place to sleep in their apartment, and they rent it out 8 hours at a time. And they change sheets every 8 hours for the next person, usually a man, coming into work, because you work the rest of the time, 12, 15, 16 hours doing manual labor, and then you come in and you hotbed. So you just have a place to sleep. And it might include a meal, but this is what immigrants did. It was immigrants helping other immigrants in this strange new world. Well, he stayed and he made some money, Baldassare, and the idea was, of course, to go back to Italy as soon as possible and get his wife, his new bride. And they came back and they did settle in Brooklyn. And several years went by. They had 3 children. They decided to go back. It was near the holidays and to see their families. And they were going back to Italy on a steamer with 3 children. Their youngest, James, was about 2 years old. And there was an outbreak of measles on the ship going back, and who would have been my uncle, James, who was 2 years old at the time, perished on the ship from measles. And of course, in those days, you were buried at sea because there was nowhere to keep the bodies. My grandmother, Philomena, she didn't know it at the time, but she was pregnant with my father, Secondo. So they went back to Italy, and Secondo, meaning in Italian second, he was the second son. He was born in Italy, so he probably should have been born in Brooklyn. But because of the circumstances, he went back, he was born in Italy. So they waited about another year, and then they all came back again to Brooklyn. My grandfather got work digging the subway system in New York City. As you can imagine, you're in the tunnels 12 hours a day, you're digging, you come home. His life was hard. My father Secundo, and he didn't speak English until he went to school. That's where, the immigrant kids learned to speak English. And of course, he was bullied and made fun of because, that's what you were, you were a WAP. And my father, too, lived a life of, they made enough money in Brooklyn and to move to New England. And my grandfather opened a shoe shine shop and a kiosk in the ground floor of a hotel, and that's what he did the rest of his life. He shined shoes. And my father would always say that they were so proud. My grandfather was so proud. He says that even through the Depression, he never missed a rent payment. And my father would go down on the weekends and work in the kiosk. But when he was 17 and he was in high school, and he entered into a program, the Civilian Conservation Corps, that was put on by FDR as part of the New Deal, where it was teenage boys without jobs and had to be single were put in this, in the New Deal. And so he was sent to Colorado to work in his high school years. But after that, he graduated, and there was no work in this town. He joined the Army, became a photographer. And after that, he came back. His life was mostly spent in the mills of Holyoke, Massachusetts. There were the paper mills, the linen mills, so towns like Holyoke and Fall River, Massachusetts, and Manchester, New Hampshire, were communities where a lot of immigrants came from the United States and Canada to work in the mills. So that was pretty much my father's life, a life of labor. So a decade later, and as I grew older, I became very interested in my DNA, where I was from, where my parents were from, what they did. So I took that DNA test, and I went searching. I did a lot of genealogy. I was searching for my roots. And one of the things that we did, my wife and I, we went to Italy. And I went to Naples, and we saw the land, the beautiful land in Italy that was so rich, the rolling hills, the olive groves, the grapes growing right there. You'd think, you had died and you'd gone to heaven. It was so beautiful. My grandfather had eventually moved to Manhattan to be closer to the tunnels, so he didn't have to make that commute because there was no cars then, of course. And so he settled right across from where the Holland Tunnel is on Hudson Street. And I went over there. I searched the documents and the genealogy, and I found the address of where he had lived. And I went over there. And the building is still there. The one next to it had been knocked down and a modern building put in, but my grandfather, my grandmother's place was still there. And I know they lived on the 5th floor because my father would tell me that they would look over across the street in the parks and they would see, they actually heard gunfire and stuff because it was the mafia. It was just starting, and it was in that area. So I stood there and I looked at that building, the 5th floor walk-up cement building, and I imagined them with their 5 children in the summer with no air conditioning, running up 5 flights of stairs with the groceries and the kids of all different ages, and my grandfather working in the tunnels. As I stood there imagining and thinking about myself and thinking about me, with my home in New York and my home in Florida, and I thought of Italy and those rolling hills, and I said, how could they ever have left that for this? And then I thought of myself and what I had, and then I realized why they had left. They hadn't left for them. They had left for their children. and they had left for their grandchildren. Now, my mother was born in Canada. Her mother was born in Canada, but they had come to Fall River to work in the linen mills. My grandmother got pregnant at 15. And when you got pregnant at 15, they sent you away in those days, and they sent her back to Montreal to be raised by nuns or to be cared for by nuns until she had the baby, which was my mother. And then they came back to Massachusetts, and my mother was given up for adoption by her parents, Napoleon, of course, and Delia, my grandmother's name, great-grandmother. So, and I was very interested in this through my DNA because I didn't know much about my grandmother's side. So their name was, my mother's maiden name was Arel, which I didn't realize and know at the time, but actually dates back all the way back to Israel. So it was a Jewish name, and I found out that they were actually Portuguese at one time, and that they had too also immigrated to France to get away from persecution, and that they had a long history in France under the name, or with the name Arel. But I didn't know at the time that I was French because my mother was adopted. She was adopted by a lovely Irish woman. So I thought I was Italian, and I thought I was Irish. So, one day when I was about 14 years old, my mother took me aside and she said, "I've got something important to tell you." And I says, "Well, what is it?" And she says, "Well, I'm adopted." And it was like the end of the world, And I said, "Yeah, thing. It wasn't that big of a deal to me." But then after a while, I got thinking about it, and she told me the story, and I was thinking, "Oh my God, I'm French. I'm not Irish." You see, in Holyoke at the time, it was, a long time ago, maybe 60 years ago. And the French lived down in what they called the flats, and that was the poor part of town. And when you were goofing off and you screwed up, someone would look at you and say, "What are you, French?" Because that was the derogatory term at the time. And now all of a sudden, I was French. I was a Canuck. I was a frog. I was one of those people. So it was quite a shock. I had to adjust to it. So I did research on the family name Arel, which was real interesting because it took me back to some of my cousins, in the late 1800s in France. And I found that I actually, through those Portuguese sailors that left and went to France, they were a long line of pirates who had sailed with Jean Lafitte and Jean Bart and Robert Surcouf. So, I had these pirate things, so, it explains my look, But I also found that in my genes were all these poets and writers and theater directors. And so, I became obsessed with writing their stories, and they came to me and they told me what they wanted me to say and do. But it was amazing because, I have a minor in drama, and, I've owned a theater, and I've done things, and I found out, of course, it's in my blood. It's my DNA. It's who I am. So I searched this one particular ancestor that I was quite interested in, Paul Arel. And Paul was a pretty famous poet in France in the late 1800s, and I found that he had actually won a competition which gave him free access to the World's Fair that was in Paris at the time. And at the World's Fair was the bust of the Statue of Liberty, Libertas. And I also found out that it was his friend, Edouard Lebeau, another poet, who came up with the idea for the Statue of Liberty. And he had given it to the architects. He had given the idea, and they had built that. So Paul Arel, my ancestor, was on the shores along with Labeau when the Statue of Liberty was shipped from Rouen, where it was built, on the Seine River in France, where they could ship it out. And they shipped it in 214 crates. It went out by Le Havre, and 250,000 people, 250,000 people, gathered on the shores all the way out, including my ancestor, waving handkerchiefs and waving goodbye with tears in their eyes, as they did when they always sent their people to the new land. And it was sent on the ship Isere, and it went to New York Harbor, where again, 250,000 people sailed out and waited for it on the shores to arrive in 214 crates. And it was immigrants that were there waiting for it and unpacked it and put it together and mounted it. The Statue of Liberty was also another poet that was on the shores to see it off. And she also had Sephardic Portuguese roots. And her name was Emma Lazarus. And she helped raise money by auctioning off her poem called The New Colossus, with the words, you know them, say them if you'd like. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses, yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed, to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. So the immigrants with roots as deep as an oak tree lifted up, mounted Libertas. And now I, 50 years later, another family poet, ride the subway tunnels that my Italian grandfather helped to dig, on my way to Staten Island to pass the Statue of Liberty that was so important in the life of my French ancestors who were celebrating. That statue was celebrating the liberty and freedom that both countries shared. And I passed the Statue of Liberty on the Staten Island Ferry as I went out to Staten Island to deliver the poem, 214 crates. And I thought as I was returning and coming back that I said I was thinking that perhaps it's time to move that statue down to the southern border, perhaps to put it there, because it would be taller than any wall that could be put there. It's huge. And I thought about that statue, and I thought that, you know, if we're not going to honor it, if we're not going to live our lives honoring the liberty and the intent in which that monument was given to us, that perhaps it's time to send her back for safekeeping, for when we are, and then we can bring it back. And I think that it's only appropriate when we put her back into the 214 crates that we write the names of those immigrants that she has welcomed over the years, including my parents and grandparents' names. We should etch them into the wood, the salt water, damp wood, not damp from the spray of the ocean, but the tears of the immigrants that weep, sea to shining sea.